Hello again, my loves, and welcome back to either Our Lives in Horror or Strange Playgrounds, depending upon which channel you happen to be listening to this on. I've been reading a hell of a lot of independent, small press, horror short story collections, novels, basically anything I can get my hands on lately. I'm in a real glut with this stuff at the moment, and it is a really wonderful time to be immersed in horror. There is so much going on out there. As I've mentioned many, many times before, you wouldn't know that if you looked at mainstream markets. If you go into most popular bookstores, certainly here in the UK and mostly in the US too, if you go into Barnes and Noble, if you go into Waterstones and whatnot, the horror section tends to be rather impoverished. It tends to be the same old guard voices over and over and over again. You know, it's the people who have been the patron saints of this genre since the 1980s, 1970s. And don't get me wrong, those voices are incredibly important. In fact, we wouldn't exist without them. It's people like, for example, Clive Barker, Stephen King, Dean Koontz. It's people like Ramsey Campbell and H.P. Lovecraft, and so on and so forth. The people who have been the big voices, effectively, the ones who have inspired all of us who have come after. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. The problem is that it seems to be, certainly on a popular level, in a mainstream level, there seems to be this inertia. It's stuck in a kind of time warp, and that's a real shame. Given what's happening, what's really happening, if you actually delve deep, if you go into the more niche recesses, which is traditionally where horror has always effloresced, you will find that so much has happened since then. We're talking like 2 to 3 decades here, if not more. So much has happened over that time. If you look at, for example, and this is something that's come up in my Let's Plays over on the Exaggerated Elegy channel, if you look at, just the last 10 years, in video games, what has happened in horror? So much. We've moved on from sort of like the survival horror remnants that you had in the forms of, say, Dead Space and Alan Wake, into really strange, abstruse areas where you've had things like Doki Doki Literature Club, which is a horror game that pretends to be something else, that masquerades as something else. We've had things like Five Nights at Freddy's, which, although the creator is enormously problematic, has been massively, massively influential when it comes to video game horror. We've had Darkwood. We've had things like Visage and whatnot. We've had PT, things that have actually transformed the face of what horror is in video games, and has shown us different facets, different technical means of technical engagement with horror. We've had Layers of Fear. We've had so much that has removed horror from those assumptions. And the same is true with regards to literature, with cinema. There is a lot happening. It's just not happening in mainstream markets or on mainstream levels, and it's a real shame. If you asked like the average person on the street, if you just stopped them and asked them like what do they understand by horror, mostly what you would get are lists of characteristics that derive from certain kinds of horror cinema. Primarily, you would get mentions of gore and of elaborate killings and things like that, mostly derived from sort of slasher films and pornography films. You'd probably get mention of things like possession films and standard haunted house tropes and so on and so forth, but they would be derived from a very, very narrow experience, a very narrow set of assumptions, which is a real shame. If you look into the small presses that exist out there, this is particularly with regards to literature and written fiction, you will find that you won't even be able to take it all in. There's so much. There's so many new, interesting, novel voices out there, and they are doing things with the genre that have never been allowed to be done before. I mean, from my own perspective, obviously, there is this efflorescence of queer horror, of which I am a very small part, there is now space. There are not only space, but there are entire playgrounds and arenas for the production, the publishing, and the marketing of queer horror. It's horror that explores particularly queer concerns, and that is really fascinating. That is really fascinating. For one thing, it allows us who have been fans of the genre for the longest time, because horror, science fiction, fantasy does tend to attract queer people. It tends to attract queer audiences, not exclusively, but very significantly. That's for damn sure. We can now directly express and explore concerns and themes and issues and imagery and subjects that are very, very pertinent to our direct experience of reality in a way that we necessarily couldn't before because we were excluded from the genre. I mean, even with the big names, if you look at Clive Barker, when Clive Barker published, for example, Sacrament, this was in the 1990s, by the way, he was told that it would not do business. He was told that he couldn't do it because it had a gay protagonist, not trans, by the way, not even like queer defining in terms of their gender identity, just a down the line cisgender gay guy. But he was, and it also explored queer themes. And he was told that it would not work, it would not fly. Horror audiences would not go for it at the time. And this was even, in the aftermath of the likes of Poppy Z. Brite / Billy Martin, as he is now being published. Billy Martin is another one of those pioneers, I suppose, who paved the way for the rest of us, who made it so that you could write queer fiction in horror, you can explore queer themes, and you can do it. This is another thing that's really prominent, actually. You can do it fearlessly. That's a big thing at the moment, because, I mean, this is a slightly other subject, this is a bit of a tangent, but there is this thing happening in not just queer horror, but in queer speculative fiction, and it's a concern that's arising, interestingly, within our own communities, from within certain substrata of our own communities. There is this problem arising whereby those of us who write fearlessly about the experience of being queer, of being gay, of being trans, in all of its many aspects, shapes and forms, in the sense that we explore the more negative sides of that, or what are generally considered to be the more negative sides of that. If we write about it honestly, we tend to get pushback. We tend to get pushback from within certain sub-factors of our own communities who they tend to utilize the language of negative representation. Like, for example, if we write, say, hypersexualized gay guys, gay protagonists or gay characters in our fiction, then we tend to get pilloried for writing stereotyped or negative preconceptions of what a gay guy is. And that really bothers me. That bothers a lot of us, actually, because the truth is, it's not universally true, but it is generally true. We operate sexually slightly differently from our straight counterparts. Not because there's anything innately different about us, but because we are allowed to. We know, by the way, those of us gay guys, we know that straight guys are not that much different from us, really, despite what, culturally prescribed stereotype would have us believe. If they could operate sexually like we generally do, then they would do it. We know that because they do, in secret. If you go on to Grindr or any of the apps out there, a significant majority of the people you'll find are not gay guys, or not sort of out gay guys. They are people who are married, people who are in straight relationships, but who are curious, who are maybe secretly bisexual, may even be gay, or may define as straight in most ways, but just occasionally like to dip into the same-sex side of things. It's a broad church. It's an incredibly broad church, but that is something you'll find. And what's happening in queer fiction is that when we write about that experience, and we do so honestly, there is this criticism arising, and it's interesting that it's coming from preconceptions that are, by their very nature, accommodationist with regards to straight and heteronormative prescriptions of what sexuality should be. It's really interesting. It's like they want us to lie about our experience to present a more anodyne representation of what gay is. Oh no, we're all right because we're the clean gays. We don't do that. And it's really problematic. That, ironically, is far more internally homophobic than just talking about, actively discussing some of the more problematic aspects of being gay or of being trans or of being this or that, and doing it honestly within your fiction. That's what the fiction's for, by the way. It's simultaneously, we don't write it as a condemnation. It's just exploring these very honest aspects of our experiences, and it can be celebratory at the same time. It's ironic that what they want us to do is lie. They want us to present this facade, this mask to the rest of culture, it's ironically self-hating. It wants us to be dishonest about our experience, and that is not something we're going to do. The book I was published in last year, the Book of Queer Saints, that was a response to that exact thing, and in fact, much of what I write is a response to that exact phenomena. But on a broader scale, this is something you're seeing across the board. You are seeing more horror from ethnic minorities. You are seeing more horror from women. Oh my god, the women writers who are in horror now. They are amazing. They are amazing. You've got people like Georgina Bruce and Priya Sharma. You've got Paula D'Ash. You've got Laura Mauro, who's been discussed with us before. Their work is incredible. It's absolutely incredible. It's doing things with horror that hasn't been done before, that is exploring themes and issues which are relevant to current culture, to current identities, and that is what is so appealing. That's why so many of us now operate down here in what is considered to be almost like the ghetto of horror, I suppose, in amongst the independent writing and small press and even self-publishing communities. This is where it's all happening. There's so much down here, and the raw fact of the matter is a lot of us would not have been published without that. Our voices are not the kind that appeal to mainstream audiences or to vast demographics. They are niche. They are very idiosyncratic. When they hit hard. They talk to experiences that generally have been ignored within the genre and within literature in general. So when they hit hard, and that is wonderful. That is an absolutely wonderful thing to see. But if you really, really, really want to get the essence of horror, if you want to understand what that means in 2023, that's where you need to go. You need to be looking at the small presses. You need to be going onto Google, onto even the evil empire of Amazon, and you want to be typing in horror short stories, horror short story collections, horror short story anthologies, and you will find so much that you've never encountered before. The same is true in the other speculative genres, by the way. Fantasy and science fiction are also in this state of efflorescence, where once again there are more of us than there ever were before. Fantasy in particular tended to be, up until very, very recently, historically, a very, very, very prescribed genre. There were very set parameters of what fantasy meant, and there were very set voices and concerns and language that was used. It was people like Clive Barker, like Neil Gaiman, who paved the way through that, who sort of punched right through that. But you will now find queer fantasy. You will find you will find things like Tolkien-esque fantasy, but which has queer concerns in it, and that is really, really fascinating. Science fiction arguably has been quicker to adapt to these new voices, as I imagine would be its nature. Don't get me wrong, there is still an enormous amount of gatekeeping and sort of like prescribed ideology and parameters within certain spheres of science fiction publishing, but as a whole, it's been quicker to adapt, and that may be just because of the nature of science fiction in terms of its history. If you look at, like, certainly the history of American science fiction, which, by the way, is some of the fucking best in the world. I love American science fiction, particularly the stuff from the 60s, 70s, bleeding into the 80s. It's so transgressive. It's so interesting. You look at people like Ursula K. Le Guin, who, by the way, does stuff with fantasy and science fiction that is still revolutionary, that is still so avant-garde, is so out there, so transgressive and pushing boundaries. People like Philip K. Dick, of course. Philip K. Dick is one of my idols, by the way. In terms of his writing, he is one of my idols. I mean, I don't seek to emulate his writing, but I see parallels in the concerns that we preoccupy ourselves with and the way we express it. I think Valis may be one of the most amazing pieces of work I've ever read. I don't know if I'll ever read it again because it's so difficult to read. It is, and not in the sense of the prose. The prose is amazing, but it hurts to read. Valis hurts to read because it is one of the most sincere portraits of a mind collapsing in on itself I have ever come across. It is the collapse of identity and assumptions of sanity in prose form. And it really hurts knowing that was actually what was happening to Philip K. Dick as he was writing. That's basically what happened to the man. And he expresses it on the page, and it's beautiful. It's unfathomably beautiful. I would highly recommend that you go out there. And, you know, Philip K. Dick is easy to get a hold of these days, for now. If you just go onto Amazon, go into a bookstore, you will find Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said. You'll find, obviously, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, aka Blade Runner. You will find We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, aka Total Recall. You will find all of them readily available, and they are stunning. I think one of my favourite collections of his is one I read called Human Is, and it's, oh my god, it's so good. Oh, it just gives me chills. It gives me absolute chills thinking of that. Such a beautiful collection. Ursula K. Le Guin is another one. Ursula K. Le Guin, she makes most just writers in any genre look like they're asleep at the wheel. In terms of the ideas she's willing to explore, her utopian science fiction is unbelievable. It's unbelievable, the intelligence of this woman, her ability to explore ideas in a fearless way, to push right through any parameters of assumption, is unbelievable. She was discussing utopias in like Futurescape's utopia settings where assumptions of gender and sexual orientation had totally gone away, had evaporated in the 1960s and 70s. She was so transgressive and so progressive. It's unbelievable. Her work is unbelievable. And you will find that now. You will find that now if you go and look into, you'll find sort of like the descendants of her writing, if you like, in the small press, the independent presses, down here in the ghetto, if you like, down here in the catacombs. This is where you'll find it. You are not going to find it by going into a mainstream bookstore, I'm really sorry to say. Not at the moment you're not, because the big publishing houses are basically collapsing in on themselves, and they are terrified of not making a profit. So they publish basically the lowest common denominator stuff. It's your celebrity ghost authored nonsense. By the way, I know I've said this before, but if you ever see a book that's authored quote unquote by a celebrity, it's the dirty knowledge, it's the dirty little secret that every writer knows that they didn't write it themselves. No author writes their own work. No celebrity author writes their own work. It's ghostwritten. It's ghostwritten by people who are paid to do it. And it's celebrity biographies and crap like that, nonsense like that, which has no worth or meaning whatsoever. But banal, conciliatory, just brain rot, sedative, basically sedative for the eyes that is determined not to upset or move or arouse its reader for fear of alienating them. It's really, really, that makes me sad and makes me rather angry. I'll be perfectly honest, because it's absolutely killing any legitimacy there is in publishing. Voices like Clive Barker and Stephen King wouldn't get a look in these days. That's the truth of the matter. They wouldn't get a look in these days. In the same way that people like Kate Bush or David Bowie would not get a look in the mainstream music industry these days. It just wouldn't happen. Because they're too weird, they're too out there, they're not prescribed enough, they don't conform to the templates enough of what makes money, you know? And it's a real shame. But that's not to say that it's not happening. It is. Again, it's happening in beyond the mainstream. It's happening in these niche quarters where you need to go and look for it. You need to go and look at what's happening. Horror video gaming is a really good example of this. If you go and look in the indie gaming scene, which by the way has made some real progress, has actually managed to break into semi-mainstream markets thanks to things like the PS Store and whatnot, and Steam, etc. For all their problems, for all their many, many problems, you will find some really interesting experimental work, some of which has had some amazing mainstream success. Well, my loves, that's enough ranting from me. Until next time, bye-bye.